Thank you very much. So at this point, we're going to move into our panel discussion. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists to open up their cameras. And I'm going to start with a question to each of the panelists, and you can figure out who'd like to go in what order as Heather and Cypress start funneling me questions from the audience. But I'd like to ask firstly, for each of you, what is the biggest data gap in the area of microplastics in food and water that you see? All right, I'm going to pick on Dr. Coffin first then. So what biggest data gap do you see for microplastics?
Well, I'm torn between saying just one, because I think the exposure and the hazard both have significant data gaps. For the hazard, we don't know the relative toxicities of the different types of particles that we're exposed to. Once we figure that out, I think that we would have a much better time assessing the human health effects. We also need better hazard studies, as Dr. Ellis Hutchings mentioned.
Thank you. Dr. Wiggins?
I would agree with Dr. Coffin. I think that the toxicity studies are lacking. And with respect to the occurrence in foods, I also think with respect to all of the types of foods that we consume, not having quantitative data or information on that wide range of foods, and in particular those foods that would be representative of what the population is consuming, is lacking. But I agree, whether or not there is a hazard, both of those are definitely necessary. I'm not sure which takes precedence or which should come first, but I think those are the two most outstanding data gaps.
Thank you. Dr. Ellis Hutchings?
Yeah, great. I'd just add on to what's been stated already. One of the key things that I think we need are representative materials to be used in the testing, whether it's uptake or hazard studies. That really needs to be anchored to what is in the environment. So there's a combination of exposure, right, that would drive the science studies. None of these materials are meant to be in the environment. So creating test materials that can be used in scientific studies is not a small challenge. So that's why these commercial materials have been used, but they lack representativeness to what's actually commercially made and then has the potential to unfortunately get into the environment. So a little bit of a long-winded answer, but representative test materials, I think I put at the top of my list.
Thank you. Dr. Paul?
Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, I'm obviously interested in social data, but I think the real question we need to face is the one I posed in the talk. What's enough evidence? What's the threshold? How much more do we need to monitor and understand? I understand we need this research about human health effects in particular, but what is enough? And when we talk to people, I mean, I think most of you on the call have a toxicology background. And when we talk to people, sometimes we get this sense that it's not the toxicology per se, it's also a moral issue. How do we integrate this in the decision making? So people say to us, we don't want any plastic in the environment or in us. Clearly that's unrealistic now. But you know, how do we take these decisions? What's the threshold? What's the limit?
Thank you. Dr. Law?
Yeah, thanks. Just to be clear, I do not have a toxicology background, but I am going to pick up from where Sabina left off and also sort of echo that, you know, we can't eliminate all plastics from our society. It's simply not an option. And so I often look to the work on human health impacts, exposure and impacts to help guide what will ultimately become some hopefully policy decisions, right? Or whether that's a ban or whether that is a way to try to recapture more material so it doesn't end up in the environment. I think, you know, the risk to human health, perceived and actual, is going to be a huge driver in having to make some very difficult decisions about these materials.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Sultan.
I think what I want to mention has been already been captured, but just a couple of things I would like to add is Given some of my experience with nanomaterials, I'm a chemist, worked on particles for a long time. One thing that we need to do in the front end now as the field emerges is QA/QC of the data. We need to set up not only a minimum set of parameters that we need to report in publications and documents at an early stage, but also we need to set up some pretty strong rules on QA/QC. And the other aspect I would like to throw in as well is building in the thinking of what can we learn from other types of particles. Microplastics are not unique. We've been studying particles for hundreds of years now. So how do we bring a lot of that learning into our thinking as well? You need.
Thank you very much. All right, our next question, actually, Dr. Paul already asked it, so that kind of cracks me up. So this was actually addressed to Dr. Salton and Dr. Coffin, but I would say that others on this panel will have input as well. If there's not enough evidence right now to define regulatory levels, how much more evidence or background are you hoping to have in order to effectively define those levels? And I would assume also take action.
And that's a great question. From the Canadian perspective, typically how risk assessment works is it's sort of a continuum. You have qualitative assessments and you go to more quantitative, more refined approaches that help inform your decision making. So we're in this field, you've heard today a lot of uncertainties, a lot of questions, and that dictates the level of action we take. We apply safety factors, we apply all sorts of different uncertainties and safety nets into our decision making. And as the information and the research progresses, we're going to tighten up those assessments, tighten up that risk management, and make more informed decisions. That's just how it works with all chemical substances, and what we're hoping to do with microplastics as well.
I'll just add that if we were dealing with a single type of contaminant here, if it was just polystyrene spheres, then I think we would have enough evidence to derive regulatory levels for drinking water. But we're not. We're dealing with an extremely complex mixture of particles that requires a factorial amount of studies to understand the differences between the toxicity of these particles. And once we have a breadth of evidence that shows the differences of the toxicities of those individual particle traits, the fibers versus the fragments, polyethylene versus polystyrene, nanometer particles versus 1 micron particles, then we will be able to more adequately assess the risks and move towards developing regulations.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to add on? Yes.
Can I also just add something? When I talk to industry, for example, one of the things that is discussed is the transparency about the mixtures and the materials that are used. And I think that's another thing that we could start on at the, where do these materials come from? If they are made simpler and there's more control, more knowledge about that, that would certainly help the end of pipe problem as well.
Thank you. Is there any others who would like to add on? All right, I'll move on to the next question. This came up during one of the 6 talks, but I think it's a great question. There's lots of observations within the talks about the needs for standards, but who do you think is best suited to create those standards? Is it multiple organizations, or do you want an ISO standard or an ASTM standard or something like that? So I'll open that to whoever feels.
I'll take a first shot at that.
Thank you.
I do think there are already activities underway, or there's activities that can be pointed to, such as the work done in the nanomaterials space over the past 10 years. There's a lot of work on the standard side in regards to analytical. I am not an analytical chemist. I'm actually not involved with the standards bodies, but I'm aware that there's a lot of good work that's being done. And Dr. Coffin might have more insight into that area, but there's a lot of effort that's underway. The challenge is these are slow moving efforts just by their design. So if there's a way to speed that up, that would be great. The same challenge exists on the toxicology side. We have test guidelines that exist, and there are new test guidelines that have been considered for nanomaterials, let's say, from the OECD. do we need new test guidelines for microplastics? Maybe not, but there's a lot of good, solid work that can be looked towards to build off of. And that's a good place to start.
Thank you.
And I just want to add on top of that is that not all standards are the same. There are different needs for different types. For if you're doing a research study, you don't need a sort of measurement standard or measurand that you're looking for. If you're looking for a regulatory approval package, they're different. So not all standards are the same. Some are much more straightforward than something like an ISO-based standard or ASTM standard.
I'll just add, in the United States, I know there's interest by NIST, the National Institute of Standards, to pursue standards. And also there have been some activities by the Joint Research Center in the EU.
I've been communicating with NIST, and we're developing some proficiency testing samples with them so that we can assess the laboratory performance for the methods that we developed here in California. And just to put in perspective the methods that we've developed and some of the ongoing method developments that are being conducted through the ASTM and the recently completed JRC study over in Europe, these methods I consider to be sort of the first step. We have a good enough method to look for the larger particles, which unfortunately are not the ones that we actually are concerned about for human health. They're the particles that can easily be identified with Raman and IR, but if we want to actually get a handle on a human exposure, we're going to need additional method validations for methods that can get much smaller particles, whether it be spectroscopic based or mass based using something like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry.
And maybe one other point, there's if we're talking about food, right, there's a lot of talk that's good research that's been done in the drinking water space, but food has unique challenges due to the matrix that exists there. So there's one project in Europe that has started in regards to methods development for food, food processing and food packaging. It's called the Cornet Project, and OFI is one of the organizations that's a lead. So people can find information online for that, but that's 1-2 year project. But again, this is a methods development project. It's not at the point of standards development yet.
Thank you very much. All right, next question is there any research being done on how to remove, remediate, or dissolve the microplastics from the environment that you're aware of?
I can take a first stab at that one. From the ocean perspective, there certainly have been some efforts aimed at trying to remove microplastics. From my perspective, those efforts actually started off in the quote unquote garbage patches, which is kind of like the very end of the tailpipe. At this point, we're dealing with plastics that have been in the environment for a very long time, are very dilute in the sea surface, and are quite small. That said, we can think more about upstream solutions. So from the perspective of wastewater treatment, you can even start in your own home by putting a filter on your washing machine to prevent microfibers from textiles from even entering the wastewater treatment plant to begin with. So I think all along those pathways from the point of use to the point of entry into the environment, there may be some ways that we can intervene and try to capture the particles. At what scale those can actually be applied and what scale the removal might or the prevention of entry into the environment might be achieved remains an open question. But, from the perspective, at least of the secondary microplastics, I always like to say, if we prevent the big stuff from getting into the environment, the chances of it becoming little stuff that we and other wildlife are exposed to are much smaller.
I'll just add that when considering wastewater treatment plants, we want to make sure that we're not just reapplying the biosolids or what goes into the solids onto our land, which I mentioned in my talk a little bit earlier.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, my next question is very food related. Does a dietary pattern of consuming more fish, seafoods, organic products, and fruits and vegetables increase the risk of microplastic exposure and potential hazard?
I don't think that we can really say that. I mean, again, given the limited information and the levels of quantitation that we're seeing, I didn't really mention any of the quantitation in my talk because I guess, we can sort of add an asterisk next to those amounts, given the methodology challenges that many of us talked about throughout the talk. But if you want to think about things maybe a little bit more relatively, I will just point out that for seafood, for example, many of the studies had ranges, for example, of not detecting any particles in the seafood to up to concentrations of about 20 microplastic particles per organism. So I just kind of wanted to put that sort of a range of perspective in play here. And so if you look at some of the other commodities that microplastics have been reported in, some of those other products have had higher concentrations reported. But then you also have to take into consideration the consumption of those different types of foods. And like I said, the reports for foods so far have been very specifically limited to only certain types of foods. I think that it's just too early to tell to give any quantitative exposure values.
Dr. Paul?
Yeah, can I just add to that? Dr. Wiggins, earlier I was fascinated by the data you showed on the food preparation, which indicates that we need to know a lot more about the variance in food preparation methods and how many microplastic particles they might add, or I found that fascinating because to me that's the behavioral perspective, and it might not be the product per se or the food item, but what people do with it, and then we can do something about it. We can have recommendations and so on.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to add anything to?
I'll just say that it's difficult at this point to say if we have different exposure levels based on our diets, but what we can say with some degree of certainty is that there's certain products that can contribute more exposure to you when you heat them in particular. So there's been several studies that have found very high levels of microplastics release from heating a tea bag, a synthetic polymer tea bag, and baby bottles that have formula in them. Some of these are showing levels in the billions of microplastics from one exposure. And so if you're putting your plastic packaging in the microwave or pouring boiling water over it, you may want to just be a little bit aware of the potential exposure.
I think these last 2 points are very interesting. Like when I think about how we regulate foods, it's generally the foods that are sold, at least in Canada. So once you get past that into the consumer behaviors in the house, it becomes definitely more of an education campaign than anything you can regulate. So I think that's an important point. Dr. Ellis Hutchings?
Yeah, maybe just to add a little bit of context, when we think about uncertainty in regards to what could be coming out of a bottle or a tea bag, it gets back to that aspect of analytical. Is it plausible that some could come out? I think yes, but the analytical controls that are needed to get at a precise number, I think are largely lacking. So for example, if we talk about millions and billions of microplastics coming off, we don't really, we need replicated data, and we need good analytical. So I think it's too early to put precise numbers until we really have a solid understanding of what the analytical QA/QC is behind that type of work. And I think there's a lot of effort in that area, but I think it's still early days. And so, some of the things that we start to see when some of these publications get replicated, the numbers change, and that doesn't mean that they go away. But the early indication that it could be a microplastic, maybe it's an oligomer or some other soluble material. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some concern about that, but I think our certainty around the information that's coming out is still very, very low or very high uncertainty.
Thank you. So I wanted to finish the last question. with one on demographics and social sciences again, but so it's aimed at Dr. Paul, but then we'll open it to the rest of the panelists. And it's, Dr. Paul, will your demographics allow you to look at differences among people who live in coastal communities and those who live inland? And those whose work relies on fisheries tourism and others who might see plastics more often in their environments?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We do actually have some data, not in the food context, but we have some data on concern about marine litter and plastic pollution. And it is related to where people live. So if they live near the coast, they tend to have higher concern. And especially if they tend to see, or I have to be careful, if they report seeing plastic pollution. So this personal experience seems to link to expressed concern, and then hopefully also a tendency to do something about it. What was the second part?
I think it went back to that perception. So it's those whose work relies on fisheries tourism and others. So
yeah, I'm not aware of any data personally about profession or whether your livelihood relies on fishery, for example. But what I do know is we have some projects in Southeast Asia, for example, and the link between the livelihoods and plastic pollution or the health of the ecosystems is, of course, much closer in many instances. So those tend to be people who are highly motivated to protect the ecosystem, but they also have a lot of pressure to continue fishing, etc. So, but I don't have conclusive data on this.
And Dr. Lai, I wondered if you had anything to add, because you had a lot of your surveillance data that went through the inland water routes as well as coastal.
Oh yeah, that wasn't my data, the adventure scientist data. I actually do have a thought that I can speak for myself personally, but I think this might apply more broadly, that plastic waste, plastic litter is everywhere. And many of us don't even see it because we're so used to just seeing the wrapper on the street or the cup off the side of the road. And so I know when we think about, especially moving upstream, it's really important to bring this message to inland communities and to make people aware of what's happening in their own environment. And so there are lots of apps and like things like that community science program that ask people to walk in their own neighborhoods or their own towns or their own schools and snap photos of litter that they see in their own spaces. And I know when I first started this work, I just had a day where I looked around my entire workspace and thought, oh my gosh, it's all made of plastic. And so this really does lead to the point of we rely on these things and they're not going to go away. And we have to make really hard decisions about what to use and what to keep and how to properly handle it. Because I think it is everywhere, and whether somebody has noticed it or not may just be a matter of where they are on this journey.
Thank you very much. So we're in our last 2 minutes, and I'd like to just see if there's anyone on the panel who has a final remark or two that they felt they were not able to say yet. All right. So I'd like to thank you all for that very excellent discussion. Just as a reminder for the audience, today's webinar was recorded, and the recording and presentation slides will be posted to the Food Forum in the coming weeks. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation today, and we hope you'll join us again at future Food Forum events.